Think of a world where everything you know and everyone you love can be taken away in a single day. A world where a queen's crown is torn from her head and she is dragged in chains before her people. For centuries, the name Genghis Khan has meant power, conquest, and an empire that stretched across continents. But his sharpest weapon was not his horses or his bows. It was something far more cruel, a weapon that broke the spirit of nations. Genghis Khan used women, from queens to slaves, as part of his conquest. This is the untold story of how the suffering of women became a silent force behind his terrifying empire. Have you ever heard a story that made your stomach turn? A story of pure human cruelty? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're ready to uncover more hidden, often dark, chapters of history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and like this video. Join our quest to bring these silenced voices and forgotten tales back to life. In the year 1206, a man named Temujin made history. He managed to do something no one else had done before him. He brought together all the different, often fighting, Mongol tribes. These tribes had lived separately for a very long time, spread across the vast grasslands of Central Asia. Temujin was a tough man. He had a hard life growing up, facing hunger and betrayal. These early struggles taught him how to survive and how to be strong. They shaped him into a leader with a clear, fierce vision. When he united the tribes, he was given a new, powerful name, Genghis Khan. This name meant universal ruler. It was a promise of the massive power he would soon command. From that moment, his empire began to grow at an incredible speed. His horse-riding warriors were fast and skilled. They moved like a storm, sweeping across Asia and even reaching into parts of Europe. City after city fell before their might. Kingdoms crumbled, and old ways of life were completely destroyed. Genghis Khan's victories were great for his empire and his people, but behind every victory, behind every new piece of land taken, there was a terrible hidden cost. This cost was mostly paid by the women of the conquered lands. They faced suffering that is hard to imagine. Their lives were changed forever, often in the most brutal ways. The strength of the Mongol army was undeniable, but the deep wounds they left on women were just as powerful, creating a legacy of pain that echoed through generations. When Mongol soldiers took over a city or town, the scene was always one of chaos and fear. The air would fill with screams, dust, and the smell of smoke. People would try to hide, to run, but often there was nowhere to go. After the fighting stopped, a different kind of terror began. The victorious Mongol army would then decide the fate of the people they had just defeated. And a major part of this process involved the women. These women were not seen as individuals with lives, families, or hopes. They were treated as spoils of war. This terrible term means they were like prizes or property taken from the defeated side. They were divided up among the Mongol soldiers and leaders. It was a cold, systematic act, not just random cruelty. The most beautiful women, or those from noble families, were often taken by the Mongol generals and important leaders. They became part of their personal households, used as servants or concubines. Imagine the horror of standing there, watching this happen. Wives were separated from their husbands. Daughters were pulled away from their mothers, never to see them again. The bonds of family, which are so important in any society, were violently broken. This separation was final. There were no goodbyes, no last hugs, just the harsh reality of being taken away to an unknown future, alone and terrified. The women were robbed of their identity, their freedom, and any hope for a normal future. Their old lives vanished in a moment, replaced by a dark and uncertain fate. The cruelty of the Mongols went beyond just taking women captive. They often used women to break the spirit of entire communities right in front of their eyes. This was a deliberate tactic, a form of psychological warfare designed to crush all hope and resistance. Wives were often made to watch the brutal killing of their husbands. They saw their protectors, the fathers of their children, cut down without mercy. The sight, the sound, the absolute helplessness they felt was a torture far worse than any physical wound. Mothers faced an even more horrifying choice. They were sometimes forced to hand over their own daughters to the Mongol soldiers. Imagine a mother's heart breaking as she is made to deliver her child into the hands of her captors. There was no way to refuse, no way to protect her children. This act of forced betrayal, forced surrender, was the ultimate destruction of a mother's love and duty. It left scars that could never heal, a feeling of guilt and despair that would last a lifetime. These acts of forced witnessing were not just random events. They were a clear message from the Mongols. They wanted to show absolute power. They wanted to make sure that no one would dare to resist them again. By forcing people to watch such horrors, they aimed to destroy the will of the survivors. The trauma spread faster than their armies. People who lived through these terrible events would carry the pain and fear inside them. They would tell the stories to their children, and those children would tell their own children. This meant that the trauma of the Mongol conquests lived on for generations. It wasn't just about the physical destruction of cities. It was about the destruction of people's minds and hearts. The fear, the memory of what was lost, the images of loved ones suffering. These things haunted communities for decades. They created a lasting shadow of entire cultures, a deep wound that reminded everyone of the terrible price of war with Genghis Khan. Even queens and noble women, those who lived lives of power and luxury, were not safe from the Mongol fury. Their high status meant nothing to the conquering army. In fact, their capture often served a very special purpose for Genghis Khan: to show the world that no one was beyond his reach, to show that his power was absolute. Consider the story of Turkan Khatun. She was the queen mother of Khwarezm, a powerful and wealthy empire in Central Asia. Before the Mongols arrived, she was a woman of immense influence. She was used to giving orders, making important decisions, and living a life of great comfort and respect. Her palace was grand, her clothes were rich, and she was surrounded by people who honored her. But all of that changed in an instant. When the Mongols invaded Khwarezm, the empire was completely overwhelmed. City after city fell, and the royal family was hunted down. Turkan Khatun, once a queen mother, found herself a captive. She was dragged from her royal chambers, stripped of her dignity, and put in chains. Her journey as a captive was long and terrible. She was paraded through various cities, not as a respected queen, but as a public spectacle. This was done to humiliate her, to show everyone that even royalty could be brought low by the Mongols. Her ultimate fate was a sad and lonely one. She was imprisoned, far from her home and her people. She died in obscurity, a forgotten queen. Her story is a powerful symbol of what happened to countless other noblewomen and princesses. These women, once admired and powerful, were treated as mere objects. They were used as concubines, slaves, or political pawns. Some were forced to marry Mongol generals, a cruel way to connect the conquered with the conquerors. Others were simply paraded in chains, living roof of Mongol dominance. The sight of a queen or princess in chains was a powerful psychological weapon. It crushed the morale of the conquered people. It sent a chilling message to other kingdoms. If even their powerful queen could be treated this way, then no one was safe. It showed the Mongols cold calculation. They knew that breaking the women of a kingdom, especially the powerful ones, was a way to truly break the spirit of the entire nation. It left a lasting scar, a memory of absolute humiliation and helplessness. The Mongols were masters of not just military strategy, but also psychological warfare. They understood that to truly conquer a people, you had to break their will, destroy their connections, and make them lose all hope for the future. Women were often used as tools of fear to achieve these goals. They became central to the Mongol strategy of control and total destruction of the enemy's spirit. One way they did this was by threatening women to make men surrender. When a city was under siege, Mongol generals would often threaten to harm or kill the wives and daughters of the defending soldiers if they did not give up. This put men in an impossible situation. They had to choose between fighting for their city and protecting their families. Many chose to surrender, seeing it as the only way to save their loved ones, only to find that their families were still taken or harmed. Even more cruelly, families were sometimes forced to betray each other. Imagine living in a conquered city full of spies and informers. A child might be forced, under threat of death or harm to their mother, to reveal where a father was hiding. A daughter might be made to denounce her parents for some small act of defiance. This tactic destroyed trust within communities. It turned neighbors against neighbors, and even family members against each other. It made people feel isolated and powerless, unable to rely on anyone. By taking women, especially those of high birth, and giving them to Mongol soldiers or scattering them as slaves, the Mongols aimed to break the bloodlines of the conquered people. This was a form of cultural destruction. If the noble families could no longer pass on their names and traditions through their children, their ancient lineage would die out. It was a way to erase the identity and history of a nation. This was not just about control, it was about wiping out the future of a people. This systematic destruction of families and bloodlines had a very dark purpose: to destroy hope for the future. If a people could not raise their children in their own culture, teach them their traditions, and pass on their heritage, then that nation would slowly fade away. The terror of constant surveillance, the fear of betrayal, and the loss of family bonds created a society living in constant fear. This deeply rooted fear ensured that resistance was nearly impossible. The women became a silent weapon in this terrifying plan, used to crush not just bodies, but the very soul of the nations Genghis Khan conquered. This was not random cruelty. Genghis Khan knew that by targeting women, he could destroy the spirit of entire nations. He understood that a people's strength often came from its families, its heritage, and its hope for the future. By shattering these things, especially through the systematic abuse and displacement of women, he could achieve a deeper, more lasting conquest than any battlefield victory alone could provide. It was a cold, calculated strategy. It ensured that not only were bodies broken, but hearts and minds were also permanently scarred, leaving a legacy of fear and submission that lasted for generations. This was a war fought not just with swords and arrows, but with pure terror and the destruction of identity. It is important to understand that not all women under the vast Mongol Empire lived the same terrible fate. There was a stark difference between the lives of Mongol women and the women who were captured. This contrast highlights the immense power and influence that some women held, while others were reduced to mere property. Mongol women, especially those from noble families or the family of Genghis Khan himself, often had a surprising amount of influence and power. In their traditional nomadic way of life, women were strong and skilled. They were crucial for the family's survival and the economy. They rode horses, set up camps, and managed family affairs, while the men were away fighting. This made them respected and gave them authority within their own society. Important Mongol women, like the wives and mothers of the great Khans, often held significant political power. They could rule territories when their husbands or sons were away on military campaigns. They acted as regents, meaning they ruled in place of a male ruler who was too young or absent. They advised their male relatives on important matters of state and even helped choose the next Khan. Women like Berta, Genghis Khan's first wife, or Sorghaghtani Beki, a daughter-in-law of Genghis Khan, were known for their intelligence and political skill. They commanded respect and wielded real power within the empire. They were part of the war conquering power, not the conquered. They lived with relative freedom, a life very different from the settled societies they overran. However, the lives of conquered women were the complete opposite. They lived in constant fear, slavery, and humiliation. They had no rights, no status, and no control over their own bodies or futures. These women, once free, were reduced to property. They were forced into labor, made to work in fields or serve in Mongol households. Many faced sexual slavery or became concubines, completely without choice or dignity. They were just objects to be used and discarded. The cultural identity of these captive women was also taken away. They were removed from their homes, their traditions, their languages, and forced into a new, often hostile, environment. The contrast could not be starker. A Mongol queen could rule over vast lands and make important decisions, influencing the future of an empire. But a conquered queen, like Turkan Khatun, lost everything and became a slave, stripped of all her former glory. This difference shows the two very different realities that existed side by side under the same powerful Mongol Empire. For one group, it was a time of rising power. For the other, a time of utter devastation. The stories of women's suffering spread like wildfire across Asia and into Europe. Even in a time before modern media, news traveled through merchants, refugees, and the returning armies themselves. The tales of what happened to wives, mothers, and daughters in the conquered cities became part of the terrifying legend of Genghis Khan. People everywhere heard about the cruelty, the destruction, and the fate that awaited those who stood against the Mongols. This widespread fear was not just based on military might, but on the deeply personal stories of horror and loss. The survivors of the Mongol conquests carried their pain for generations. The memory of lost loved ones, the trauma of forced witnessing, the scars of slavery, these were not things that simply faded away. They became part of the collective memory of entire peoples. Grandmothers would tell their grandchildren the hushed stories of how their own mothers were taken or how their families were torn apart. This oral history, passed down from one generation to the next, kept the suffering alive. It was a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the immense brutality they had endured This legacy of suffering shaped how people viewed Genghis Khan and his empire for centuries. While some saw him as a brilliant military leader who built one of the largest empires in history, others saw him as a brutal conqueror whose rise was built on unimaginable human misery. The stories of queens turned to slaves, of families broken, of women reduced to property. These dark shadows are an undeniable part of history. They remind us of the immense human cost of conquest and power. These memories serve as a powerful historical lesson. They teach us that war is not just about battles and victories. It is about the lives of ordinary people and how war can shatter them in the most profound ways. The hidden stories of women in Genghis Khan's wars ensure that we never forget the full price of his empire. The memory of queens turned to slaves remains part of history's darkest shadows, reminding us of a time when human dignity was mercilessly stripped away. This was the story of women in Genghis Khan's wars, from queens to slaves. Their silent suffering is a powerful, yet often overlooked, part of history. If you want more untold history, if you hunger for the hidden truths of the past, help us reach 1,000 subscribers by subscribing now. And tell us in the comments which empire's hidden story you think we should cover next. Your support helps us bring these vital stories to light. The devastation for these conquered women was not just a single, terrifying event. It was a new, harsh reality that stretched on for years, sometimes for entire lifetimes. Their days became a grueling cycle of forced labor and relentless servitude. These women, once free individuals with hopes and dreams, were now mere property, stripped of every right and dignity they once knew. Many were put to work in the vast fields of the Mongol Empire. They toiled endlessly under the relentless sun, planting and harvesting crops to feed the massive Mongol armies and their rapidly growing population. The work was exhausting, demanding physical strength they might never have possessed before. Their bodies ached, their spirits wore down, but they had no choice but to continue. Others were forced into heavy construction. They built new cities for their conquerors, hauled heavy stones, dug deep irrigation canals, or fashioned bricks from mud and straw. Their hands, once perhaps skilled in delicate crafts or domestic duties, became rough and calloused from the unceasing, backbreaking labor. Every muscle protested, but the lash of an overseer's whip or the pangs of hunger ensured they kept working. Inside Mongol households, many women became domestic slaves, a fate often unseen but deeply personal. They cooked meals, cleaned sprawling tents and houses, fetched water, and cared for the children of their captors. They served without complaint, moving through their days in silent obedience, knowing that any perceived transgression or refusal could mean severe punishment, even death. Their lives were not their own. Every waking moment, every breath was dictated by their Mongol masters. For some, the fate was even more intimate and tragic: forced concubinage. This meant they were compelled to live with Mongol men as secondary wives or sexual partners, without any say in the matter, completely against their will. Their bodies were no longer their own, their personal dignity crushed under the weight of their circumstance. They often bore children who would grow up knowing only a Mongol identity, entirely cut off from their mother's original heritage, language, and cultural ties. These women had absolutely no voice. They could not choose their partners, their work, or any aspect of their futures. Their cultural identity was systematically attacked and erased. They were brutally separated from their families, their cherished traditions, and their native languages. Every single day was a stark, painful reminder of their immense loss, their helplessness, and the absolute, crushing power of their conquerors. Imagine a woman who once sang ancient lullabies in her native tongue, full of stories of her ancestors. Now she might only whisper them in secret, or perhaps cannot sing them at all for fear of being overheard. Her children might grow up speaking only Mongol, never learning the intricate tales and melodies of her own people. This was a slow, painful death of a culture, not through outright war, but one generation at a time, through the quiet suffering of women. The Mongol strategy aimed to destroy the very roots of any future resistance or rebellion. The Mongols did not stop at simply taking women during the initial violent conquests. They also established a cruel system of regular tribute. Conquered regions, even those that had long submitted, were often forced to send specific numbers of people, including young women, to the Mongol capital every single year. This was a constant drain, a systematic, continuous removal of people from their homelands, a wound that never truly healed. This human tribute wasn't just about providing labor or partners. It was a clear, unambiguous sign of absolute submission. It constantly reinforced the idea that the conquered people were forever under Mongol control, that their lives, their children, and their families were not truly their own, but belonged to the great Khan. This relentless demand for women, year after year, further broke down the social fabric and the very spirit of the subjugated community. It also had a profound and lasting impact on the demographics of these lands. The systematic removal of young women meant fewer marriages within the original culture, fewer children born to carry on their traditions. It was a silent form of population control, ensuring that the conquered populations slowly dwindled or became inextricably mixed with the Mongol bloodlines, eventually losing their distinct identity and fading into the larger empire. The impact went deeper than individual suffering. It was about the slow, deliberate erosion of entire cultures. Women are often the keepers of tradition, the first teachers of language, stories, and customs to their children. By displacing them, by forcing them into new roles, the Mongols attacked the very heart of a people's identity. Children born from forced unions or raised in Mongol households grew up without knowing their mother's true heritage. They were taught Mongol ways, Mongol history, Mongol loyalty. Their link to their ancestral lands and traditions was weakened, often completely broken. This created a new generation, disconnected from their past. The deliberate destruction of noble bloodlines, as we discussed, was a key part of this, but it extended to common families too. If a village lost its women, its families could not continue in the same way. The chain of cultural transmission was broken. The old ways of life faded, replaced by the rules and customs of the conquerors. This cultural destruction was a powerful tool for maintaining control. A people without a strong sense of their own identity is less likely to resist. A people whose family bonds have been shattered is less likely to unite. The Mongols understood this deeply. They knew that breaking the spirit was just as important as breaking armies. Think of it as sowing seeds of doubt and despair into the very soil of a nation. Over time, those seeds would grow into submission and compliance. The memory of what was lost would become a silent burden, a constant reminder of the conqueror's power, passed down through the generations.
Genghis Khan's use of women in this way was a cold, efficient strategy. It wasn't about spontaneous violence, though that certainly happened. It was about a calculated system to control vast territories and diverse populations for centuries. The suffering of women was not an unfortunate side effect, it was an integral part of the plan. This calculated cruelty was a cornerstone of Mongol rule. It ensured that conquered regions, even after the initial storm of conquest passed, remained subdued. The fear of what could happen, the memory of what had happened to their women, kept people from rebellion. It was a deep, pervasive dread that settled over the land. The empire needed stability to grow and thrive. By using women as both spoils of war and instruments of long-term control, Genghis Khan created a terrifying foundation. It was a peace built on trauma, a stability maintained by the constant threat of renewed horror for those who dared to defy him. This silent weapon was incredibly effective. Despite its clear importance, the extent of women's suffering in the Mongol conquests is often overlooked in traditional history books. Military victories, grand strategies, and the names of powerful men usually take center stage. The personal stories, the quiet despair of countless women, often remain in the shadows. Why is this? Partly, it's because history has often been written by the victors, and by men who focused on different aspects of war. The daily lives and suffering of women were not always considered important enough for the grand narratives of empires. The records kept often spoke of numbers of people, not their individual fates. Also, the victims themselves were often silenced. Those who survived might have been too traumatized to speak, or feared further reprisal. Their voices, if they existed in the historical record, are often faint, buried beneath layers of official accounts. It takes careful digging to uncover these hidden truths, but ignoring these stories means we miss a huge part of history's lessons. It means we don't fully understand the true cost of empire building, the human price of power. It means we don't see the full picture of how societies are broken, how cultures are erased, and how fear can be wielded as a weapon. This channel exists to bring these silenced voices back to life. To look beyond the famous generals and the grand battles, and to explore the often painful experiences of ordinary people, especially those whose stories have been pushed aside. The women of Genghis Khan's empire are a prime example of such a forgotten narrative. Their suffering wasn't just a footnote, it was a central pillar of the Mongol legacy. It shaped the conquered lands for centuries, creating a deep-seated fear and a profound sense of loss that rippled through generations. Understanding this helps us understand the true nature of power and conquest in that brutal era. The psychological scars left by these events ran incredibly deep. It wasn't just the physical wounds, or the loss of loved ones. It was the complete breakdown of trust within communities. When families were forced to betray each other, when neighbors became informers, the very bonds of society were shattered. Imagine living in a world where you couldn't trust your own relatives, where fear made people turn on each other. This constant suspicion and anxiety became a part of everyday life. It eroded the foundations of human connection, making collective resistance almost impossible. This was a direct result of Mongol tactics. The trauma also manifested in a loss of identity. When traditions were forbidden, when languages slowly died out, when children grew up disconnected from their heritage, there was a profound sense of emptiness. It left a void, a feeling of being rootless, even for those who survived physically intact.
This feeling of being lost, of having a stolen past, passed down through generations. Even if the immediate threat of Mongol soldiers faded, the stories of what happened, the whispers of forced choices and broken families, lingered. They shaped the collective memory, creating a narrative of vulnerability and immense loss. This generational trauma meant that the effects of Genghis Khan's wars continued to impact people long after his death. It wasn't just a historical event, it was a living wound, influencing how people viewed themselves, their history, and their place in the world for centuries to come. The echoes of the screams, the images of loved ones being taken, the feeling of utter helplessness, these ghosts haunted the lands that Genghis Khan conquered. They became a part of the cultural tapestry, a dark thread woven into the fabric of daily life, reminding everyone of the absolute power the Mongols once held. This kind of memory, this deep historical pain, influences how people relate to authority, how they build communities, and how they pass on their own stories. It shaped their resilience, but also their vulnerabilities, making them more cautious, more watchful, always aware of the fragility of peace and the suddenness of terror. Therefore, when we look at Genghis Khan, we must look beyond the legends of his military genius. We must acknowledge the full, brutal truth of his methods. His empire was not just built on horseback and steel, it was also built on the shattered lives and stolen dignity of countless women. Their suffering, their resilience, and the lasting impact of their experiences are a crucial, undeniable part of the story. It is a testament to the immense human cost of conquest and a powerful reminder that history's true lessons often lie hidden in the untold stories of the vulnerable.